All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to everybody joining us here, everybody joining us online. My speech today really serves as a double introduction, the chance to introduce not only our esteemed guest speaker, but also to introduce the Blue Center for Global Strategic Assessment. The Blue Center was launched this summer thanks to the tremendous generosity of Neil Blue, Yale class of 1957. And the center's mission is to advance the interdisciplinary study of statecraft by bringing together leading scholars and practitioners, supporting research and teaching related to national defense, diplomacy, intelligence, and international economic relations. We're incredibly proud to host for our first event the current Prime Minister of Kosovo, Albin Kurti. Prime Minister Kurti was a 22-year-old student at the University of Pristina in 1997 when a wave of student protests erupted against the anti-Albanian discrimination of the government of Yugoslavia under the dictatorial regime of Slobodan Milosevic. Those student protests were both a manifestation of and a key accelerator of a larger movement for Kosovo autonomy responding to anti-Albanian repression that had deep historical roots and that acquired particular force with Milosevic's rise to power in the late 1980s. In a history with which many in our audience, I suspect, are deeply familiar, in March 1999, Yugoslavia launched a massive military campaign in Kosovo, triggering the displacement of close to 1.5 million Albanians and a NATO intervention on humanitarian grounds. During that campaign, in April 1999, Prime Minister Kurti was arrested by Yugoslav forces and spent more than 2.5 years as a political prisoner of the Yugoslav regime. Following 3 months of intense combat, including significant NATO airstrikes, Yugoslav forces withdrew, and Kosovo came under UN administration. Kosovo ultimately declared its independence in 2008 and has since been recognized by the United States, 104 UN member states, including 22 of the 27 states of the European Union. Kosovo's young history reads as a textbook story of the statecraft required of a new nation, from the foundational act of declaring independence to the ongoing diplomatic effort to secure recognition, to the pursuit of membership in international organizations such as the EU. The story of Kosovo's development is one in which students can see quite clearly the crucial work of the state and its enduring relevance as an organizational principle for international relations. Kosovo is also a country whose history is now deeply enmeshed with the history of the United States. To give you a sense for this, the so-called initial entry force that arrived in the area of Ferizaj Jarosevic in June 1999 was composed of elements of the 3rd Brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, a unit in which I was proud to serve 20 years later, a unit in which Dan served, elements of 10th Special Forces Group, a unit in which 2 of my current Jackson students currently serve. Thousands of young Americans have served in Kosovo since 1999 as part of the Kosovo Force, the KFOR, the 4,500 member strong NATO peacekeeping force still stationed at Camp Bondsteel. So, as the Prime Minister will no doubt discuss, the 25 years since Kosovar independence have been dynamic across many of the domains of statecraft. The government has had to grapple with complex military matters, from the presence of a sizable NATO force within its borders, to the mandate to grow indigenous military capability, to the need to grapple with Russian aggression on the continent. Likewise, Kosovo has confronted deep questions of economic statecraft, how to strategically develop natural resources, how to balance attractive economic overtures from a country like China with commitments to liberal Western principles. Kosovo today, therefore, represents, in many ways, a perfect case study in managing the intersection of political, military, and economic forces, the relationship between security and governance, and in the confluence between deeply local and ethnic concerns with great power politics on the largest scale. There is no one better to reflect on that recent history of statecraft than Prime Minister Kurti. The Prime Minister has held the premiership continuously since 2021, in office he previously also held from February to June 2020. Prior to his first term as Prime Minister, he was a member of the Parliament of the Republic of Kosovo for 10 years. So, independence in 2008. In other words, the Prime Minister has been engaged in public life for almost the entire time that Kosovo has been an independent state. During that time, the Prime Minister has gained a reputation as a reformer, while pursuing determined campaigns towards EU accession and against Russia's regional meddling. Kosovo has developed one of the most hopeful economic stories in Southeast Europe, demonstrating steady economic progress since independence, including a nearly 50% increase in per capita income and a 35% reduction in the poverty rate, according to the World Bank. So in sum, Prime Minister Kurti is exactly the sort of practitioner whom the Blue Center is honored to host at Yale, and from whom our students have much to learn. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and bring to the podium the Prime Minister of the Republic of Kosovo, Albin Kurti. Mr. Prime Minister.
Dear students and professors, it's a distinct honor and pleasure to deliver the inaugural lecture of Yale's new Blue Center for Global Strategic Assessment, which aptly examines the interdisciplinary nature of statecraft. As a head of government, whenever you feel honored or humbled, you remember that you represent a country and its entire people. It is never about you personally. So yes, I accept this honor because I believe Kosovo is a prime example of the very topic of discussion, namely the successful and dramatic evolution from a genocide surviving people to a functioning democracy and a growing economy in just 25 years. When asked to reflect, history presents a seeming paradox. Some things change significantly while others remain the same. This lecture reflects on both the things that remain constant and the ever-changing dynamics of Kosovo, or the political life of any country for that matter. When I visit the US, I am reminded of the rapid technological shifts. Sometimes it feels like we are on the cusp of something transformative, even when we haven't fully grasped the present reality. Many of you, of course, have been following the discussion of how far generative AI has evolved, how fast its effects are being felt, and what the consequences will be. Opinions on this matter vary greatly. There is a sense of novelty here, a dynamism and capacity for innovation that I've noticed is less pronounced on the other side of the Atlantic. And yet, certain things remain unchanged, though they may take different forms. The uncertainty surrounding upcoming elections is constant in what has been dubbed the year of elections. We are in a continual state of analyzing which aspects of a campaign could prove detrimental to the final outcome in November. And of course, topics taking center stage in this election, gender, economic, and other forms of inequality do persist. Even in 2024, amidst all the unprecedented change, some things remain evergreen, such as the central question, how to strengthen democracy, and in times of crisis, how do we save it? The same paradox, this coexistence of change and continuity, is also present in the political and general life of Kosovo. While we in Europe may not be at the forefront of technological breakthrough to the same extent, the country has nonetheless been transformed. If you've seen Kosovo over the last 25 years, you might not recognize it today. This year, as we hosted many foreign leaders during our celebrations, they couldn't either. I would argue that we have made monumental political transformations. Mr. Kaplan's introduction takes me back to my student days. The protests in the 1980s in Kosovo were an inflection point, the canary in the coal mine. By the end of the 80s, the autonomy Kosovo had enjoyed since 1974 was revoked, leading Slovenia to call for recognition of human and civil rights in Kosovo. As violations worsened, the calls echoed across Europe and the West. And when I joined protests in the late 90s, which meant being brutally beaten by Serbian police, it was the last call to stop the violence before it escalated. A few months later, war erupted, resulting in genocide and other crimes that the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia later termed crimes against humanity. Now the country is led by a government that is freely elected, where protests are encouraged, and where the police work for the people. This is evidenced by the latest Gallup poll, which ranks Kosovo among the top 10 countries worldwide for the Law and Order Index score, placing us among nations like Norway and Switzerland. It is a country where education is encouraged. Public universities are now free of charge for bachelor's and master's students, and where 50% of the STEM, science, technology, engineering, math student body are women. International organizations recognize us as an electoral democracy. Change triggers further imagination, brings uncertainty, and enhances fear. In times of uncertainty, we must ground ourselves in what remains constant, independent of circumstances or location. For us, that constant is our origin story, what we were fighting for. A country must define what it stands for. It cannot solely define itself by what it opposes. Every people has an origin story that follows it throughout history. For us, liberation is that story, and it influences us profoundly. The origin story of the United States of America, rooted nearly 2.5 centuries ago, still influences the dynamism and value of freedom in this country. Our story is still within our living memory. Its influence is profound and actual. I have two perspectives on Kosovo. I refer to the country's name in Albanian, which I believe is more authentic for me as a native speaker of Albanian. One perspective is as an outsider, a citizen who has analyzed and critiqued the government. The other one is from the position of someone in power. From both perspectives, I can say that this is a country that values the freedom to build a democratic society based on the rule of law. Our origin story contains many of the multitudes that helped shape the country and continue to inform our vision. Our story is one of seeking the recognition of human rights. It is a story of having our plight acknowledged by our allies, especially large powers such as the US, the UK, Germany, Italy, and France, of democratic cohesion, and of honoring the efforts of many by creating strong and transparent institutions that, at their core, serve human rights and an ideal of free and equal citizenship. Our population skews young, with an average age of 34. With that youth, we had to embrace a vision because the immediate aftermath of the war was marked by great devastation and persisting uncertainty. Even the country's status was unresolved. In 2000, our GDP was merely $1.8 billion. This year, for the first time in our history, our GDP reached double digits. But the growth, especially over the past 3.5 years under my government, has been achieved in alignment with democratic values. One of our country's greatest strengths is the coherence between our foreign and domestic policy. We are fundamentally an ally of liberal democracies. This means we join in sanctions against Russia while also investing in clean energy reforms domestically. I've seen cases where governments are democratic in foreign policy, but less so in their domestic policies, and that cracks sooner than later. This makes our partnership with our allies authentic and informs every aspect of our governance. Returning to the analogy of change versus continuity, there is something that is unchanged, a major question about security in Europe and naturally the Western Balkans as well. The war in Ukraine is the first European war in over 100 years that the Western Balkans have not participated in. But that doesn't mean we are unaffected. We are especially vulnerable to Russian aggression because Serbia maintains close ties with Russia. The ties are not merely historical or religious. The two countries are deeply intertwined in their economies and ideology. Russia has a majority stake in Serbian energy companies, for example, and Russian investments in Serbia have increased eightfold since the invasion of Ukraine. But the influence extends far beyond the fields of energy and intelligence, reaching universities, media, and the broader cultural and intellectual spheres. Serbia is the only European country, other than Belarus, to refuse to impose sanctions on Moscow for the war in Ukraine. It has also never voiced any opposition for any other war that Russia has waged, including the war in Georgia and 2014 invasion of Ukraine. This alliance has also invited the presence of China, which is Serbia's primary trading partner outside the EU. There is a sense that the depth and breadth of ties between Russia and Serbia, and consequently Russia's direct influence in the region, have been underestimated by Western political figures. For us, the threat is not theoretical. Almost exactly a year ago, around 100 Serbian paramilitary troops entered our country and opened fire on our police, killing one sergeant. Despite the technological developments and extensive information available to identify the perpetrators, there is no accountability from Serbia. The Serbian and Russian threat also persistently endangers other countries in the region. For example, Russia unsuccessfully attempted to buy the port of Tivat in Montenegro in 2015. The following year, it orchestrated a coup against then Prime Minister Milo Đukanović. We are keenly aware of the region we operate in. We aim to be guided by democratic values while tailoring them to our context, shaping our military, economic, social, and political structures. Militarily, we focus on ensuring the safety of our citizens and their freedom from threats. This focus has driven our increased defense spending, and we have benefited greatly from the NATO presence, which has helped us build and strengthen the Kosovo security force. For instance, we have surpassed 2% of GDP spending on our military. This coherence between values and action, both domestically and in foreign affairs, has led to the institutional stability our country has needed. Liberal democratic order with a social democratic government is what we believe in and people want most. Our government will face elections next year. It will be the first time in the post-independence period that we will have completed a full 4-year term in office. Our government has achieved many firsts. It is the first time we have made public higher education free in our country. It is the first time publicly owned companies have begun operating at a profit or break-even point. It is also the first time our institutional services have extended to the northern part of the country, which had previously become a quasi-lawless zone rampant with crime. It is the first time we have given universal subsidies to new mothers and to children below the age of 16, and the first time we have given incentives to the private sector to stimulate the hiring of youth, women, and individuals who come from families who are unemployed. Kosovo citizens have now visa-free travel to the European Schengen zone, which covers the EU, and we have just concluded negotiations for a free trade agreement with EFTA, which consists of Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. This is the second time in the past week that a poll or event has brought us closer to Norway and Switzerland, which is exactly the desired outcome. We have earned the trust of our people, as evidenced by a 2/3 increased tax revenue during our mandate without changes in fiscal policy, an indication of people's confidence in the government's strategy for managing and allocating resources. In these times where facts are increasingly questioned, this trust matters greatly. 2016 was a pivotal year on both sides of the Atlantic, with the US elections and the Brexit vote. Since then, the shifts have become more pronounced, and in such times, urgency and agility matter more than ever. Democratic backsliding is a global concern. According to Freedom's House February report of 2024 in the World Analysis, the world has experienced nearly 2 decades of democratic decline. This has been worsened by the rise of authoritarian powers like China and Russia, conflicts such as the war in Ukraine, and the spread of right-wing extremism, even in countries that were once seen as safeguards of democracy. For my country, Kosovo, this means stronger alliances with democratic allies. It also means urgency in joining NATO and the EU, likely in that order. This urgency also implies a commitment to necessary reforms. And all geopolitical voids left in the Western Balkans and beyond will be weaponized. In the current landscape, no empty space is neutral space. There is a strong need for democracies, both existing and emerging, to stand firmly together. This requires us to view authoritarian threats with caution and accept the limitations of bridge building. If you have followed Western Balkans politics, you will have heard both the government and analysts express skepticism about appeasement, be it towards Belgrade or Moscow. I understand the desire for bringing different and ideologically opposing parties together. If successful, it is a far better alternative to conflict. But we have also seen the limits of economic interdependence in securing peace. The war in Ukraine has already cost Russia over 70,000 troops and another 400,000 wounded soldiers. This shows that some countries are willing to sacrifice their own people to invade another nation. Its commitment to violence is well documented. Since 1817, Russia has been involved in 48 wars with an average interval of 4.4 years between them, from the beginning of one to the beginning of the other. Europe has long coexisted with an imperialist Russia, but the current geopolitical landscape and human rights protections make such coexistence increasingly difficult. As their power wanes and becomes a far cry from the heights of their imperialism, their danger increases as they forcefully seek to regain influence. The way we respond to such aggression will not only shape our relationship with Russia, but also with all other authoritarian powers. The action of authoritarian powers and the responses of democracies are closely watched by other nations gouging their own limits in these situations. And this question before us requires a telling answer. The story of Kosovo is manifold, but overwhelmingly it is a story of success, the success that came from fighting for human rights and later creating institutions that uphold these rights. It is also a story of perseverance in transforming and trusting that political major changes can happen when the right to vote is exercised. It is a story of the importance of alliances. Just as people mirror each other through interactions, so do countries. Our alliances from the start have served as important models in how we shape our governance and our future. For example, the Council of Europe, the foremost human rights body on the continent, has lauded Kosovo as having one of the strongest constitutional protections for human and minority rights across Europe. It is also a story of grounding oneself in core truths during a changing landscape, truths that has inspired our tireless fight to become the youngest country in Europe after declaring independence in 2008 and remain our North Star as we move forward. The future of our country asks us to be both optimistic and vigilant. The success of Kosovo becoming the leading Western Balkans democracy and experiences an average of over 6% of GDP economic growth in the past year are signs of a bright future. As we continue to reform and work toward full integration into NATO and the European Union, our path is clear, standing firm in our values, working hard, innovating, and prospering. And that is why Kosovo is such a success story. It is a stark example of a simple but powerful message that democracy can thrive despite all the challenges, threats, and uncertainties. The hope and strength of the people is the biggest and most lasting victory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, is this on? Great. Mr. Prime Minister, thanks so much for that amazing speech. Let's kick it off just by looking out at a modest future timescale. In the next 2 years, what do you hope your country and your administration can achieve?
I believe that social progress, first and foremost, implies economic growth being combined with social justice, which further on implies social insurance and progressive taxation. So we want to further reform our country, but only once we have brought the entire economy within law by eliminating even the gray economy, so to speak. There is no black economy in Kosovo whatsoever anymore, but there is still some gray economy. And prior to progressive taxation, we need to eliminate gray economy because we don't want to punish people who contribute most. On the other hand, we have started this project of Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is still waiting for the verdict of Constitutional Court. Sovereign Wealth Fund will bring together publicly owned enterprises with agricultural land that we are saving from the former privatization agency. And at the same time, we want to enable people to buy shares and participate in economic growth in a democratic manner by being active not through voting only, but through shares in companies as well. So we want to democratize economy. And this is a big project where shareholding approach for all the citizens will be replacing abusive and brutal neoliberal privatization, which was prominent especially in the first decade after liberation. And the third thing that we are very much after is making operational bureau for confiscation of inexplicable obtained wealth. If public servants, politicians, and all citizens in general cannot prove that their wealth comes from their income, then we shall problematize that as a society by the help of the state. Whenever we have done different measures for the society when it concerns the poor, there was not much of debate. But whenever we wanted to make measures which would problematize wealth of some people, which they could not explain how they got it. Then there was resistance of some powerful centers. So we shall come out victorious in this struggle as well in our next mandate. But generally, we want citizens to trust more institutions by also increasing their self-confidence. We don't want citizens who only outsource trust to institutions, but people who trust elected institutions because themselves they've become more active in society.
Let's flip the lens and look at the foreign policy side. Those are all domestic initiatives. One of your best known foreign policy initiatives is your pursuit of EU accession. And yet 5 EU countries still do not recognize Kosovo. So I'm curious how you think about the problem of partial recognition in the drive towards accession, and if you could give us a general overview of how you feel accession is progressing.
We want to join EU because we fully adhere to the foundational values of European Union. On the other hand, we believe that European Union is the most important political project and economic vision for peace and prosperity also for the 21st century, not only for the 20th century, in the entire world. A continent where there are too many nations in a relatively small landmass and where the 2 world wars occurred is very important for the entire globe and international affairs. We want to both benefit and contribute to that by answering to thousands of questions that we expect next year European Commission to handle to Kosovo together with the candidate status and one day to join EU. On one hand, we had gotten visa liberalization without having 5 non-recognizers on board. Since 1st of January, Spain recognizes passport of Kosovo, and with passport of Republic of Kosovo, you can go to Madrid. This was not the case before 1st of January this year. On the other hand, we have a Stabilization Association Agreement, which is a contractual agreement that we have with EU in spite of 5 non-recognizers. However, in order to join EU, definitely we need 5 non-recognizers to recognize us. Sooner rather than later is definitely better. We work both multilaterally in different kind of European forums with them and bilaterally. Atmosphere towards recognizing Kosovo is better with them. There are some small concrete steps, but as we know from life, many small things do not really make one big thing. So we're still not to that eventful point when they will have to join the majority of EU, namely 22 countries who do recognize us. We need also the help of those who have already recognized us in getting Spain, Slovakia, Romania, Greece, and Cyprus on board. Joining NATO, we have 1 country less, Cyprus. Out of 33 NATO members, 29 of them do recognize Kosovo. But this is the decade where we should rectify the situation and join EU. With the inclusion of Western Balkans 6 into EU, EU becomes Europe, whereas Balkans is in Europe.
If you'll permit me a personal question. One of my colleagues at the Jackson School is Professor Timothy Snyder, and he's just written a book on freedom. And in that book, one of the things he talks a good bit about is the impact that speaking with people who have been imprisoned has had on the way that he thinks about freedom. And so I'm curious if you'd be willing to share with the audience a little bit about how your own experience of imprisonment has impacted your worldview, your politics, and your view of freedom.
Initially, I was a political prisoner, turned into prisoner of war. And since there was no war anymore, I was just a prisoner, kept hostage by first regime of Milosevic and then also the democratic government in Serbia, in hoping to exchange us for some benefits that they would have gotten from US. And big amnesty in Serbia, which took place, was also with the help of US Congress, who to democratic government of Serbia gave a certain financial support, and as a gesture of goodwill, hundreds of Albanian prisoners were released. So I cannot say that the prison in which I was a typical prison. It was with torture and with anxiety and fear, where almost all of us never thought that we will get out alive. So it's not a prison where you get in for certain wrongdoing, for violation, for criminal deed, and then you serve your time and you get out. It's not like that. So in my case, rock hard concept is liberation. So liberation is so factual, so objective. It really happens and you can sense it with all your senses. Liberation, breaking out from the prison. And this coincided with the liberation of Kosovo as a fact, with NATO intervention, in addition to our liberation struggle. So liberation is the rock solid concept, whereas freedom, for me as a former political prisoner and prisoner of war, is more dreamlike. Freedom is something that you dream of, and it gets expressed in different kind of conversation in prison, where all the inmates more or less agree that if they could only get out, they're going to do this and they're going to do that, and it's like it's a lot of visionary things within the concept of freedom. And now, as Prime Minister, for me, freedom is something which I view as a right of citizens in a well-organized society. So freedom is not anymore a historical event, but I see freedom more in terms of an ensemble or plethora of rights that citizens, human beings do have in their pursuit of happiness, in their quest for better life and for well-being and for professional and personal flourishing.
It's interesting. It coincides a little bit with how Professor Snyder writes about freedom. He talks about freedom from and freedom to, right? Positive and negative ideas of freedom, and elaborates quite a bit about, you can achieve liberation, you can achieve freedom from, and then what comes next is maybe a little bit more dreamlike and requires citizens to articulate and act and seize the effects of a free life that come after. I'll follow up with one more question, and then I'm going to kick it to the audience. So if anybody would like to ask a question, I'd ask that you make your way to the microphone. We probably won't get to anybody, but I'll turn to you all next. Final question from me. I was at a meeting recently, and the Foreign Minister of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, had an interesting insight, and I'm curious to get your take on it, given the attention that you've been paying to Ukraine and to Russia on the continent more generally. His insight went something like this. The thing that small and mid-sized European states, one thing that they can really bring to the world stage with a tremendous amount of persuasiveness and experience is the notion that in the 20th century, colonialism was not only a project of Europeans and Americans in Africa and Latin America. It was also a project of whites against whites in Eurasia, perpetrated in large part by the USSR. And so one of the things that Foreign Minister Sikorski said was, especially in the global south, when he is the foreign minister of Poland, when Baltic states, the states from the Balkans, travel around the world, one thing that they can convey is that Russia's actions in Ukraine and elsewhere on the continent are in many ways rooted in this same colonial historical pattern of thinking. So I'm curious about how you feel about that insight, and in general, how you feel Kosovo, what's its role on the world stage? What does it bring? What insights does it have that maybe the great powers, so-called, do not?
Great powers have great power and little time. And here sometimes smaller nations and countries suffer, because you need a bit more attention and care and aftercare than great powers can offer. In this sense, decolonization is very important for restoration of the dignity of the citizens and for sustainable development and social progress of those countries. So we have seen all over the world too often countries being liberated and then ending up in dictatorships or in new kinds of ruins, which made people suffer further. In this respect, I believe that all what we know from history and from books from experience and from theory about decolonization, we should employ in the struggle for liberation of Ukraine. American Association of Sociologists issued a statement, I think it was in 2023 or even as early as 2022, about colonization, Russian colonization of Ukraine. Wherever they occupy a village, they change the names of the streets, they change the monuments of that town. They bring different political, cultural, literary figures because they want to change your nomos, the name of your land. And I think that decolonization is not something reserved for former colonial powers like Britain and France. It has to do a lot with Russia today, with Russian imperialism. And side by side, I think that all our knowledge and experience of anti-fascism should be reactualized against Russian Federation. Our grandparents were unfortunate to fight German and Italian fascism. But fascism is not reserved for Germany and Italy. It is a plague that can fall upon every state and nation. We have to be vigilant. Our generation lives at a time when Russian fascism is on the rise and is trying to ride westward towards Europe. So decolonization and anti-fascism should be again notions of our discourse in helping freedom of nations and democracy for countries.
With that, let's go to the audience. Diarmuid, you want to lead us off?
Yes, and thank you so much for being here. I had a question. My name's Diarmuid, I'm from Ireland, and in Ireland we have seen our fair share of internal conflict and external oppression in the past. And I wonder, in this context of former conflict and recent independence, how you balance representing the majority while also respecting the dignity and rights of the minority in your country, which is a challenging thing to do when a country has a history such as yours.
Number one, we must have a robust defense through constitution and laws for minority rights. And to be able to defend and to cherish the language and culture of minorities. Number two is an approach which never puts the sign of equality between peoples and states, between citizens and governments. So when I say Serbia, I never mean Serbs. When I say Serbs, I never mean Serbia. But the same is valid also for Kosovo or for Ireland, for that matter. I never put the sign of equality between political system and the form of government on one hand, and the name of the country with current citizens living in that place. And number three is we must create the opportunity and guarantee the feeling of participating in progress to each and everyone without leaving anyone behind. So it is the task of the state to help first and most those whose needs are greater. So not only this, let's say, normative aspect, normative dimension of consideration for the minorities, but also utilitarian one from their perspective, not from our perspective. So to make sure that they will benefit, to show that integration helps them. Even though you might be facing another country or center of power who wants to make integration unnecessary. So this is the play between majority and minority. I think that generally we have been doing well, but definitely there is more space for improvement with ever less time, because we have to do it fast. And that perhaps goes to trying to understand better and listen more to proper dissenting voices who engage in criticizing the government.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, it looks like we have two more who have risen, so I think we probably have time to do those two quickly, so please.
Prime Minister Kurti, thank you so much for being here today. On a rather similar note, I would like to ask you about the situation in northern Kosovo, and especially with the municipal elections. So it would be an understatement to say that Serbia has been hostile to Kosovo and has been weaponizing people who are identified as ethnically Serbian and live in northern Kosovo. But in your previous answer, you talked a lot about this importance to understand and reach out to people and maybe try to bring them back on the side of the Kosovo instead kind of distance them from this hostile Serbian center. So then my question would be, what would be your strategy to kind of bring people who now even boycott the elections and who kind of refuse to even take part in this Kosovo state project? How will you be able to talk to them? How will you try to bring them on the side of the Kosovo independent project? Thank you.
Official Belgrade, in my view, suffers from a paradoxical trauma, if I may say so. They have lost what they didn't have. Because if you have something and you lose it, sooner or later, you may and can get over it. But when you lose something you didn't have, is very problematic. And I think that has happened. And now what we see is a kind of a prolonged hangover of a former small empire. For our Balkan context, Serbia was a small imperialist power. Because in the world, there are not only big imperialisms, there are also small imperialisms who do a lot of troubles in the neighborhood. And there is this prolonged hangover. Here we need the help of EU, of US, of NATO, of all freedom-loving nations and democratic countries to help Serbia to emancipate itself from the past, namely Milosevic, and from the present, namely despotic President Putin. So this is very important to happen sooner rather than later, because prolonged hangover is causing a lot of stress and anxiety in the region. On the other hand, we are quite safe and secure in Kosovo. There are no internal sources of insecurity or destabilization that we cannot manage and control. That's why Belgrade is more aggressive, because it's nervous out of its powerlessness. Of course, we have some hybrid war to fight, and Serbia's bigger and stronger than us. But in terms of Serbia's parallel structures inside Kosovo, they have really lost the battle with us. Serbs in Kosovo have a certain sense of relief from criminal structures. However, there is no enthusiasm, and there is no happiness among them. And this troubles me. I want them to be happy. So there is a relief from those structures, but not enthusiasm for our system. And in this intermezzo is very important what we do. We will have next year local elections, and I really hope legitimacy will be greater, because current mayors that we have in the north are legal mayors, but their legitimacy is hollow due to low turnout. However, they are the ones who are there, and with violent mobs, you cannot take over the buildings. So we will have to defend them, and we're trying to do our best to include them. For example, 11% of people in Kosovo who get social assistance are Serbs, even though Serbs are 4% of the population. We are helping them with renovation and repairment of houses, and we are also including them in our publicly owned enterprises more than ever before. So we do these measures, and still, I must admit, I feel that something in addition is lacking to make this passage from relief out of liberation from parallel structures into some sort of rather joyful embrace by the means of embarkment into political system of Kosovo and its democratic institutions.
All right, a final quick question and answer from Dr. Fanton.
Jonathan Fanton, member of the Jackson Board, former chair of Human Rights Watch, now working with a group trying to build support for an international anti-corruption court. I noticed you mentioned corruption earlier in your talk. Are you in favor of creating such a court? And if you are, what would be the arguments you would make to fellow presidents and prime ministers?
What was the name of the court?
It's the International Anti-Corruption Court.
We have been fighting corruption with professional police, active prosecutors, but at the same time, we have done so by leading with the example of well-educated middle-class cabinet of ministers who do not want to get rich from politics. Let me start from our example. However, we have seen, Professor, the limits of this, because high-level corruption and organized crime is not locally based. It's transnational. Because organized crime and corruption, whenever there is no rule of law, they get profit. But when there's cross-border one, they get super profit. And I do not see any other way to fight organized crime and corruption other than full cooperation between law enforcing agencies of democratic countries, which, why not, could come up with a proper international court against corruption. We have seen in our region how war criminals of crimes against humanity turn into peace criminals of organized crime and smuggling, because they are after easy money, quick profit. So yes, perhaps some international instance that would fight especially high-level cross-border corruption could do well. But then again, we need really to do all the preparatory steps in order not to have it fail by no means.
Well, Richard Goldstone is head of our drafting committee, and we're going to put a draft out in the next few months for comments, and I hope you'll comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
And Mr. Prime Minister, this was amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time. Small gift, Mr. Leah, your daughter. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great moment.
Thank you. All right, and final thank you to you all. This was great. If you're not signed up for Blue Center events, we're going to have programming just like this, aiming to bring really high-level practitioners like the Prime Minister to come speak to you all. So please do go to the website and sign up, and have a great rest of your day, guys. Thank you.